Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I'm welcoming Reverend Riley Pickett. Reverend Riley Pickett, she, her, is an ordained Presbyterian USA or PCUSA minister currently serving as interim pastor for Hagar's Community Church, a congregation planted inside one of the largest women's prisons in the Washington state. She holds her Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and is passionate about creating worshiping spaces for folks who have been historically excluded from the church, especially queer and trans people. She is happiest by a body of water, on a mountain, or when surrounded by books and her people. So let's welcome Riley to the show. Thanks for being here. What else would you like our listeners to know about you?
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Oh my gosh, there's so much. So I'm the interim pastor of Hagar's Community Church, which is a congregation planted inside the largest women's prison in the state of Washington. We are in Gig Harbor, Washington, which is outside of Tacoma, south of Seattle. So that's kind of my location. And in terms of my social location, some identities that I think are important to know about me are that I'm a queer woman, I'm cisgender, I'm in my late 20s, so I'm still fairly young. I'm ordained in the Presbyterian Church, USA, and there's more. I don't need to list off every identity, but those are maybe some things that people should know about me that inform who I am.
Great. Thank you. I will confess, I know this is about you, Riley, but I feel like I need to confess I was just recently bemoaning 20-somethings, so forgive me.
Okay, I'm almost 30.
Yeah, so we won't, I was on a discussion board I'm taking a class right now, and it was like mostly 20-somethings. I'm just bemoaning. Anyway, this episode is not about me. It's about you. So
I shouldn't have revealed my age, but you know what? I'm just honest to a fault and felt like people should know I'm still a young pastor. I'm a young woman, and that informs my work because a lot of people don't take me seriously. And it's just part of my context is that I'm a young woman in ministry, a young queer woman in ministry, and that ends up affecting a lot of things in my job, even in the prison, and the way people interact with me, and for better or for worse.
I feel like we should just scrap the entire episode we had planned and talk about that because I think that's a challenge that I've experienced in mainline circles of kind of, I don't know. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I think others will be able to relate.
Oh yeah, I know there are.
Well, tell, if you would, about your journey of faith, how you came to the faith, and what that looks like today.
Yeah, I mean, long story short is that I was born and raised Presbyterian USA. My mother, my saint of a mother, Harriet, who will be listening to this episode and will be absolutely beaming that I just said her name. She raised me in First Presbyterian Church in Pensacola, Florida. And my parents got divorced when I was really young. So the church was the family that raised me. And so I was just really brought up in the church as I feel like growing up in the church, it was less about actual church stuff and more about the people, and more about community, which maybe is what it's all about.
Yeah.
But I just really feel such warmth towards the church. And I think as I've gotten older, I've had more complicated feelings about the church,
Yeah.
and a lot of frustration and anger and disillusionment has come up. But still, I always have just such a love for the church, and because it's community, it's a place where we come together, and there's not many spaces like that.
Yeah.
Where it's just built in community, and there's just vulnerability built into it just inherently. So that was kind of my childhood, and I never thought I'd be a pastor, but I guess me playing church in the living room when I was a kid was an early sign. But I taught English for a while, and
Oh, wow.
didn't really consider going to seminary. But then I did. I had a really tough first year of teaching. I was teaching 8th grade English in Florida, and it was just a difficult first year of teaching. Is super hard, and it was just made even harder by the administration in the school. And so I decided to take a year off teaching after my first year. Already needed a year off. And I did a volunteer year in New Orleans, which is where my family lives now and where I was born. And through the Young Adult Volunteer Program, which is a PCUSA volunteer program. And I did that volunteer program. This is relevant because my supervisor that year was Pastor Lane Brubaker, Reverend Lane Brubaker, and she was the founding pastor of Hagar's Community Church, which is the church in the prison that I work in now. And so after that volunteer year, for many reasons, I applied for seminary, and I went to Princeton Theological Seminary after that year, and I graduated during the pandemic. And so I graduated May 2020, and it's wild that it's now 2022, but this call at Hagar's Community Church is my first call as a pastor. I started out doing some reentry work for people getting out of prison, and then when Pastor Lane moved away from this job, I took over on the inside of the prison as the inside pastor.
That's so fascinating that, while this isn't you're not brand new to ministry per se, like your first call has been encompassed by the pandemic. What are we calling like the 18-year-olds and below, like digital natives? Like, you're a pandemic native in your ministry experience.
In ministry.
Yeah.
Like, no, it is actually, I don't know why I haven't thought about it like that exactly, but like all my friends, like my friend Caddy in California started a solo pastor position in the pandemic as a 20-something queer woman. And like, that has been just incredibly difficult. It's just been incredibly difficult, like being a first, but also it's all we know. So there's a benefit in that, where you have pastors who've been, in ministry for 20 years, and then this comes up and it's like a huge, what do we do? What do we do?
Right.
But we had to go into it, and like, we're coming out of seminary where they teach you all the innovative stuff. And so maybe we had a benefit in coming straight into it. But yeah, it's all I've known about ministry, except for like, my little field ed placements in seminary and all the kind of little things I've done outside the pandemic. But this was just a totally different ballgame.
Yeah. Well, talk about spiritual practices that are meaningful for you or you might recommend to others.
Ooh, yeah, that is a good question. I feel like my spiritual practices lately have been communal prayer with the women in the prison and worshiping with the women in the prison. That for me has been my spiritual practice, because they teach me so much and bring me so much joy. And I am just continually getting just like absolutely different reads of the Bible than I would, I wouldn't be able to get their perspective. Getting the perspective of someone that's incarcerated is a really, I feel very privileged to be able to read the Bible through their eyes and get their takes on everything. because not many people have access to people inside of prisons. Like, they're locked away for a reason. They don't want the people that lock them up, don't want them to be a part of the community, and
Right.
don't consider them valuable members of the community. And so I get to go in there, and they just absolutely enrich my spiritual life and my faith. And I get to hopefully do things like put together Fury and Grace, which we're going to talk about, so that other people can get to hear what I get to hear. So that's like my main spiritual practice. But honestly, like, writing sermons and creating worship services is kind of a spiritual practice for me. I'm a writer at heart. I have a background in teaching English, and I did journalism for a little bit in college. I think I just say that to say I've always been interested in telling stories, and I've always loved to write. And so writing sermons to me is a spiritual practice. I could like keep going on. I love talking about spiritual practices, but that's my main thing, I gotta say.
Yeah, that's great. I'm thinking about how, I use the word pandemic native even more so. It's almost like I imagine you're kind of like leading the edge on this shift that's taking place in church, of the pastor being like the center, or the sole distributor of teaching and wisdom and spiritual thought. And like what you're doing, it sounds like in your work, and I think through this book, for example, and in the prison, is what I see is a shift taking place of this communal based teaching and wisdom and learning. So it's pretty cool that you're on the
priesthood of all believers.
Yeah, you're on the leading edge of that. So it's awesome.
Yeah, I feel like I'm like actually taking the priesthood of all believers, that like Reformed Protestant, idea. For those that, I don't know if people listening have heard about that idea, but it's basically, a way to decentralize leadership and kind of say that all people, lay people in the church, have, wisdom to share, and we're all leaders. We're all spiritual leaders in the church. And so I feel like I take that, and like it's actually like made explicit. And so like through this book, like I'm really trying to make them, I want them to be the teachers. I want people to hear their voices and their perspectives. And I want that to inform the like larger faith. Like I want their voices to be at the center of theology. Like how often have people like them been centered in theology? I mean,
right.
Not often.
Which again is cool, because again, it speaks to, I think, some of the themes or undercurrents that's been happening, I don't know, in the last 30, 50 years, certainly, I think, at least in America, of this shift from just privileged voices to trying to center and privilege marginalized voices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that we still have a long way to go. I know even in seminaries, like they try to privilege marginalized voices, but it ends up still just being kind of a side piece to the main stuff. In these theology classes, there's like a special day where you have all the people of color and their theology, but then the rest of the class is still centered on Barth and Calvin and Luther, and like, great, like those are big voices in theology, but the marginalized voices gotta stop being just kind of like a special day on the side that we just listen to for a day. It's gotta be like, I want to center those voices.
It reminds me, Jared Bias, who doesn't need any of my they do some great work, him and Pete Enns, on the Bible for Normal People. But I remember one of the things they say is like the adjectives, like all his point, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is all theology has adjectives. We just don't traditionally, like what we've classified as just quote unquote theology has really been like white male theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's kind of like a secret, like an invisible kind of those two words are invisible before theology, but when people say theology, that's what they mean. And so we
Right.
got to make sure we know what we're saying when we say
Yeah.
theology. Like, let's define our terms.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, before we talk about the book, she mentioned Fury and Grace. I just want to kind of talk about the tradition of Lent, why Lent matters. This is a book written for Lent. For some of our listeners, they may not be too experienced with Lent. I grew up Independent Baptist, so Lent was totally foreign to me. Talk about Lent, why it matters, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I will totally tell you. I'm obsessed with Lent. I can tell you all about Lent, why I love it.
Yeah,
but
go for it.
I am interested at some point, if you will. I'd love to hear what you think about Lent too, growing up not in that kind of context. But I mean, I grew up Presbyterian. Lent is a little more mild than it would be like in the Catholic Church. We didn't do a lot of fasting or anything too intense. It was more kind of like, we're going to give something up. We're going to give up chocolate. We're going to give up. Like, I feel like every year when I was a kid, it was like I'd give up some sort of like food. And it was like pretty easy. I don't really think it brought me closer to God. I think it was just like kind of a fun little challenge. But I just in general love the liturgical calendar. I love having things to mark time. I really love just like the cyclical nature of the liturgical calendar. I love ritual. And so I just really like Lent, especially because Lent comes before it's the 40-day liturgical season leading up to Holy Week and Easter. And Lent begins on Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday comes after the season of Carnival. So those that are from New Orleans or Mobile or are familiar at all with Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras season, which is called Carnival, starts on Epiphany, January 6th, and then ends on Ash Wednesday. So it's like this, Mardi Gras is this time of bacchanal and debauchery and just revelry, and just people associate it with just like getting really drunk. But it's just so much more meaningful than that for me. It's just a time of like enjoying the things that we get to enjoy being in a body. And this is relevant, I promise, for Lent. Lent is made even more special to me because I grew up with Mardi Gras, because I'm from New Orleans. And you have this time of carnival and celebration, and then on midnight of that Tuesday of Mardi Gras, the whole city they clean they stay up all night cleaning the city, and then the next morning you wake up and it's Ash Wednesday. And so it's like this time of indulgence before Lent, which is seen as a time of more temperance and of discipline and of spiritual renewal and of fasting and giving things up, and in order to kind of that discipline is in service of becoming closer to God and spiritual renewal. So yeah. Oh gosh, what else do I love about it? Do you have anything to say?
No,
about
I think
what I just said.
I don't
want to just keep talking.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You ask me growing up Independent Baptist. Independent Baptists are very like our way or the highway is the only way. And I remember even a few years ago, my old youth pastor posting something like Lent was one of those dead man's religions or something to that extent. And it's a shame, I think, because I'm kind of like, I would class myself as like low church, but appreciate ritual because like, I think, like you said, ritual has a way of like connecting us to one another, tying us to deeper roots. And that's one of the things that I appreciate about Lent, and I think, like you said, it helps mark time. And I think that's important for humans, is to have rituals and celebrations for us to mark seasons and occasions. And it gives meaning and purpose to our lives, I feel like.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think personally why I love Lent is because in another life, I would absolutely be just like a monk. I would be a nun. I would be like in a convent. I'd be like the desert fathers. I'd be in a cave somewhere with like a single candlelight with my journal and my books, and I would just like I love devotion. I love I'm a mystic. I would say I would self-identify as a mystic, and I love having this time set apart to have a spiritual discipline and to just like devote myself to that spiritual discipline daily. Like I just love the idea of that. I just love ritual. Maybe it's because I'm someone with anxiety and I just love routine. And like it's just like a really and Lent is a little bit of a darker season, I would say, even though it's coming into spring.
Right.
There's room for lament in Lent. Like it's a time to take evil seriously, both in ourselves and the world, and call for repentance, because Lent is all about repentance, turning another way, getting serious about sin. And like that can be such a turnoff for people, but I think it's so important to, like, without shame, you know, be able to confess where we have fallen short and where we've missed the mark, so that we, you know, the truth sets us free. And I love the idea of taking evil seriously, and calling for repentance. And maybe it's the like American self-help spirit in me, but I just love the idea of trying to be better than I was the day before. And I love the idea of growing in my spiritual life, of ritual and devotion and discipline. So yeah.
You have some great things there I'm going to try to build on. First, I'm going to jump ahead because what you said intrigued me about the title of the book, Fury and Grace. So the book is called Fury and Grace, 40 Days of Paintings and Poetry from Prison. So you mentioned a few things there about taking evil seriously, repentance. I think I heard forgiveness, or maybe I imagined it in my mind. But again, those things feel like they relate to your title of Fury and Grace. And especially I'm thinking, I don't know if this is what was meant. Fury, maybe the fury of taking evil seriously. Talk more about, maybe, I'm giving you a lot here. Talk more about the title of the book.
Yes. Okay. So there's kind of, I can answer that in two parts. The first part is just literally the title comes from a poem written by Rachel, who is incarcerated at the Washington Correction Center for Women. And Rachel is a longtime member of Hagar. She's been coming since the first day that the church started, when Pastor Lane founded the church. And so it comes from a title of her poem. And the title poem isn't actually in the book, which is a total missed opportunity. And it's because it's a really long poem and we didn't include it. But I'd love to, in a minute, read an excerpt from the poem, Fury and Grace.
Sure.
Just because I think I want to put Rachel's words on this podcast. Like, I don't want it to just be me. I want Rachel to speak a little bit to Fury and Grace. But we do say in the preface of the book, we talk about, like, what does fury mean to you? What does it mean to be furious? And we talk about how, like, fury, that emotion, you know, all of our emotions are connected to God and can help us learn more about ourselves and our relationship to God. And so our hope for the book is that it will not only allow you to become furious about things such as the injustices of our world, but will also allow you to become delighted, challenged, and curious along the way. We say, through your fury, may you discover God's grace. And so we just think that anger and fury, there's a use. I mean, Audre Lorde talks about the uses of anger. Like, you know, anger gives us data. Like, if we're getting angry about something, there's something that's been violated in us, or there's something that's violated a value or a boundary. And like, through that emotion of anger, like, we can follow that deeper to figure out, why am I angry, and what can I do with that anger, instead of just letting it, instead of letting the emotion control me, how can I do something with that? And through that fury, how can I discover God's grace? Like where is God showing up in the midst of all that injustice? Where is God still working?
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. Again, we're kind of going backwards here, but you hinted at it. Talk about kind of what inspired the book and what brought it about.
Yeah, so when the pandemic started in March 2020, Pastor Lane was the pastor of Hagar's at that time, and a lot of things worship became restricted in a lot of ways. We had to start worshiping, and we were doing one big worship service on Saturday night. It was like 150 people. And then when COVID hit and things started to get, we had to start doing social distancing, masking. Everybody knows I don't even need to say that. We all know. We all wear the mask every day.
Yeah.
We're over it.
Yeah.
So we had to start doing small groups of worship. So Lane was leading 6 worship services a weekend.
Wow.
Because she had to break the 150 people into smaller groups. And I'm not in the prison right now because there's a mass COVID outbreak. So
oh my goodness.
Anyone listening to this, please pray for the folks incarcerated inside the Washington Correction Center for Women, because there's a COVID outbreak and they're locked in their rooms. There's no programming, whatever. But besides the point, talk about that later. She was doing small groups of worship and they weren't allowed to sing anymore. And they weren't allowed because of the, the risk of the particles. I don't know science, the particles,
okay.
like it going out faster.
Yeah.
But so Lane started to do, she introduced art and poetry into worship as a way to connect with God and with each other, because it was a good way in a small group to be able to, instead of singing, be able to express our worship through art. And so they did a lot of painting and a lot of poetry writing. And that was kind of the book was born from that, the art and poetry that was created. And the book, springs forth from that worship. And so we had all of this art and all of this poetry, and we were like, nobody's getting to see it. We're getting to see it. It's in the walls of the prison, but like, how could this art and poetry nourish people outside the prison? And we had the idea of putting it in a book and making it into a devotional. And so we gathered all the art and poetry, and Lane Crawford and I, Crawford is Reverend Crawford Brubaker is Lane's husband, and he was really involved with Hagar's Community Church. And the three of us kind of curated all of the art and poetry, and with Cyclical Publishing's help, like we put it all together and wrote devotionals to go with the art and the poetry, and it's a daily devotional.
Yeah, that's
the
great.
Whole season of Lent.
That's great. Give some ideas on how churches, groups, and individuals can use this, again, in small group settings, in the broader church, maybe for their own private spiritual practices. What are some ideas?
Yeah, I think it's really, really good for both individual and we kind of created it with both of those things in mind. We really encourage people in the book to see the book as a communal creation. Like, this book was co-created by, 25 people. Like, it includes the art of over 20 artists inside the prison, plus me, Lane, and Crawford. And so we really want it to be, when people are reading the book, we want people to mark it up. Like, we encourage people to draw on it, to write in it, to let their imaginations run wild, and to, let it inform their own life, like let it bring up, relate it to their own life, and really just like consider the experiences of those that are incarcerated. And we just really want it to be like a springboard to a lot of conversation, whether that's internal conversation and reflection or conversation with a group. So I think we created it so that a group could use it. Each day, so it's daily, and each day has a reflection, a piece of art, a scripture, a prayer, and a question. And the question is really meant to lead to discussion. So like, for example, there's a question right here on day, I should have been more prepared and had like a day picked out. But I just want people to hear, like, these questions really would lead to deep conversation. On page 14, it says, have you ever paused to imagine how your spiritual vision and your spiritual healing are affected by memory and the habits of the heart? In what ways might a habit of prayer or participation in a worshiping community shape your spiritual eyes and your spiritual ears? And there's more after that. But these questions are really meant to, they could be used for personal reflection or group reflection.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's, again, interesting to the theme we've been talking about throughout this, of this centering of marginalized voices and perspectives. You know, you say considering the experiences of the incarcerated, and I think it's such cool work. Let me ask this. Again, as we're recording this, it's end of January. This will, God willing, come out before Lent here soon. I'm a hospital chaplain. I still believe in prayer. What are some things that people can be praying for? You mentioned this COVID outbreak, and there's we could spend a lot of time talking about the injustice of folks being stuck incarcerated and dealing with these COVID outbreaks. What are some things people can be praying for as they're listening to this for the Hagar's Community Church and the folks residing there?
I really deeply appreciate that question, and can definitely tell that you're a chaplain. I just got to say, I love hospital chaplains. I have a special place in my heart for hospital chaplains. My dad was a doctor, and when I did CP in a hospital, it just absolutely changed everything for me. And I will probably be a chaplain sometime in the future. I love chaplains. So that's super cool to learn about you. And I really appreciate that question. I mean, God, there's just holding them in the light and just thinking about them and remembering that they're in there and that they're stuck in their rooms and that they don't have access to the phone right now. They have like 20 minutes a day where they can use the phone. And sometimes, you're not going to get access if you've got a bunch of people trying to use it in only 20 minutes. And they're not getting to communicate with their families. They don't really know fully what's going on because things are just kind of happening to them. People are being moved randomly to kind of spread people out. And some people get a chance to grab their stuff and other people don't get a chance to grab their stuff. And so just like the living situation right now, the living conditions are not great. People don't have all their clothes, so people aren't getting as many changes of clothes as they need. They're having to just get their food delivered to their room. And so I think there's a lot of probably boredom and loneliness and restlessness and a lot of just isolation. And so I say all these things so people know how to pray for them. I think people are also very scared. I hear the word terrified. People are terrified. People are scared. And I hear those two words all the time, just the uncertainty of not knowing when this is going to end. It's a really big outbreak, and you have to have 10 days of no cases in order to open back up. And so I just have no idea when I'm going to be able to go back inside and lead actual in-person worship services. And having their programming taken away, programming like school and gym and chapel, those are what makes incarceration somewhat bearable. And without having that, it becomes unbearable to be stuck in a cage for, 23 and a half hours a day. I mean, that's just the human spirit, not being able to be in community. So I just ask for prayers for their mental health, for endurance and for moments to sustain them, and for them to know that they're not forgotten, that we are thinking about them and we love them, and we're just praying, we're just prayers of intercession every day that this come to an end quickly and that they come out of it as intact as they can, and that they are able to just in this time have things that really nourish them and sustain them, and that they can just hold on and remember all the people in our faith, all the people in the Bible that were incarcerated, and all those times of having to sit in a cell, and just they find solace in knowing that they have special knowledge because Jesus was arrested and incarcerated, and they get to know what that's like.
Yeah.
While we don't get to know what that's like. I mean, not that it's good that they get to know, but
right.
I just say that because Jesus, I don't bring Jesus to the prison. Jesus is already there.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is in there. Jesus is in there with them, especially.
Yeah.
And I just want them to hold on to that right now.
Yeah. Well, I can really hear your heart for those folks. So we need to take a break, but let's do this. You mentioned having a reading from one of the women who inspired this, and I feel like that'd be a great way to kind of end this segment with that reading. So do you mind sharing that, and then we'll take a break?
Yeah. It's 3 pages. Do you want me to do an excerpt? It's not, I mean, he writes really big.
Yeah, do an excerpt, font. I guess.
Yeah, I'll just kind of pick some parts out. So this is by Rachel, and she is incarcerated at the Washington Correction Center for Women, and the title of the poem is Fury and Grace. I have broken wings and shattered fate with the dreams I cannot erase. My life is timed and untamed, hidden fury, rapid sorrow, no good feelings for tomorrow, trapped in this rage, desiring to live with grace, shameful wrath that stuck with pain. Feelings I cannot blame. I want to fly away without this chain that's obscuring my point of range. Like a roaring lion that feeds off fear, their power to prance on whomever they dare. My aching heart where this darkness shreds it apart. And then there's a turn in the poem. But we should still stand tall. Pain gives strength, and then courage takes place. Integrity is taught. And thus patience is brought like a two-edged sword. Bring on the pain of tomorrow. With my might, I will hang tight with all that I can. I will not play the devil's selfish games. I will take up my cross and walk with Christ. My wings will glow. I am the clay. My potter gives me the way. My dreams are no longer of rage. My life is timed but tamed. My core of sacred grace. I have stood up and held my place. My chains are gone. I will not fall. The gates are opened, so I have good reason to continue tomorrow, because my Savior has my life. Now I stay standing and pay his price.
That was great. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Riley Pickett. Thanks so much for being here with us. Thanks for sharing that poem, and excited for listeners to check out the book. These closing questions, you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like? What do you want to do?
Okay, so there's 2 parts.
Yeah.
One part, these are my 2 options.
Okay.
And I'm sure you've heard this first one before. Abolish the papacy. Done. You've heard it before, haven't you?
That's the funnest answer. My Catholic friends probably wouldn't like that.
And you know what? I say it in jest. I just say it because I'm Protestant, and I'm sure I know that you've had a lot of mainline people on here. Abolish the papacy and rebuild from scratch. For starters, allow women and queer people to lead. So that's my first option. My second option, because I have to make everything gay, if I was Pope, I would call on every media outlet and make some global announcement that celebrated queer and trans people and called for them to be in pulpits everywhere.
That'd be a good day then. I'm trying to get like a Catholic on the show. I would be most curious how they would respond to that question, but appreciate. I really want to know. I love Catholics. I do. I had a really good friend that was Jesuit, and she was wonderful. And I would love to hear that episode too. Yeah. Talk about a theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life.
Okay. So I'm not gonna lie, I thought about these in advance.
Mhm.
So I I was like, I should say Karl Barth or Calvin or
Yeah.
Luther, but honestly, like, I just don't want to hang out with them.
Sure.
No offense
Yeah.
to them. Like, may they rest in peace. I just don't want to hang out with them.
Yeah.
Someone that I really love, who I discovered in seminary, who wrote the book Indecent Theology. Her name is Marcella Althouse Reed. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. Marcella Althouse Reed. She's a Latin American theologian. She died some years ago. I want to bring her back to life for sure and have a dinner party with her and have a glass of wine and chat because so she wrote Indecent Theology, and I looked at the book last night to remember what it said, but the back of the book literally says, all theology is sexual theology. Indecent theology is sexier than most. And that's their kind of like, they want to hook people in with that sentence. But that sounds like she'd be pretty fun to have at a dinner party, right? But
I think
more
that's
seriously, I'm just really interested in pushing the boundaries of what we consider decent and indecent. For example, queer people are still largely only accepted in church if they're like a decent queer person. For example, married, monogamous, cisgender. So like, we're still gatekeeping what queer people can come into the church, and even queer people themselves, like Matthew Vines. I don't mean to call him out. Like, he's done a lot of really, really good work, and I really respect him. But he still only argues for, decent queer people to be let into the church. Queer people that are pushing the boundaries even further, then it's really hard for them to kind of cross that boundary. But her work is just like super explosive. It's like a fusion of queer theory, liberation theology, post-Marxism, and post-colonial analysis. And just to say it's intersectional and it's asking us to just keep thinking like beyond these lines that we've drawn around Jesus, who cannot be contained.
Well, it sounds very interesting, and I like your metric there of who'd I want to hang out with.
Yeah. If I'm going to hang out with somebody, I want it to be someone that would be fun at a dinner party, not boring. I'm all about a party. I'm a Leo.
Yeah. Forgive us for the Barth and Luther lovers out there.
No, can I say that I do love Barth and Luther.
Yeah.
I do love them. I just don't want to hang out with them at a dinner party.
That's fair.
I'd listen to a lecture.
There you go. What do you think history will remember from this current time and place?
Well, a lot has happened in the last couple of years. I'm sure people will talk about the insurrection that happened on January 6th. And I'm sure people will talk about the 45th president. I'm sure people will talk about how we walk around in masks all day now.
Yeah.
But really, I think that this years long, and it's wild to say this years long pandemic.
Yeah.
I think people will talk about how it was apocalyptic, like in the true sense of the Greek word apocalypse.
Yes.
Not end of the world, but like this pandemic was apocalyptic in the sense that it revealed, it pulled away the veil, and it showed us all these broken systems, and not even broken, because that implies that they, used to be
were whole to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, but they weren't. They were designed this way on purpose, and it just absolutely pulled away and shown us the evil of these systems that are so just grounded in white supremacy. And I just become more and more of an abolitionist, a prison abolitionist. And Hagar's Community Church, we as a church are invested in prison abolition because we don't want to be going into this prison and not at the same time working to tear down these systems of death, these these absolute industrial complexes they're just death-making systems. And I just feel really called to dream and imagine a different way in light of these past couple of years, especially, and just how much it's revealed.
Yeah. What do you hope? What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
Yeah. So I read a quote recently. I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. I read a quote recently from the late Rachel Held Evans that said, I'm not afraid to say that if the church in the U.S. is dying, let it die. Let it die to the old ways of hegemony. Let it die to violence. Let it die to control. And honestly, I can't say it better than that. I love the church, but I will say that I hope that the church will be less concerned with survival and power and more concerned about living out the actual gospel, even if that means their death. I just think that the stakes are high, and that if the church dying is good for, if it serves the actual gospel, then let it die. We need to be less concerned about just keeping churches open.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Well, where can folks find out more about you and the church?
Okay, so the best place to go is just our website, which is hagarscommunitychurch.com. Hagars is Hagars, and then community church. And if you scroll down to the bottom of our homepage, you can subscribe to the newsletter. And that's where you get all the up-to-date information about what's happening. So we have events pretty regularly. Next month, we have an event with abolition apostles where we're going to teach people more about pen paling with incarcerated people. And so if you want to get plugged in with a pen pal inside of the prison where I work, especially in this time when they're locked down, come to that event. So if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll get a lot of information about the church. And then also, I try to post on Instagram. We're at Hagar's Community Church.
Great.
And I try to, if we have some sort of event coming up, I'll post it on there too. But yeah, I would love to, there's lots of ways to get involved, even if you live nowhere near Washington. So I would love to just meet some new people, reach out. My email's on the website. I'm always down to have a virtual coffee.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time, and wish you safety and health out there. And for your folks, may God's peace be with you.
Yeah, and also with you. Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.